Alright, so we're going to start with our fluid effects. So I'm going to go to my project window under File, go to New, and trim in the 2550 folder, Fluid Effects. Okay, now with fluid effects, it's under the Dynamics menu, and there's several different fluid effect type things. There's this ocean here, which is pretty, it's pretty neat. But there's not a whole lot you can just kind of like do without modeling and creating some other stuff. So this is a fluid effect type thing. Bam, ocean, done. Okay. Delete. Outliner. Maybe my delete button stopped working or something else is going on. Alright, there's also a pond, which is just smaller than the ocean. Both of those have different things that you can do. Adding dynamic locators, adding a boat locator, making boats, motorboats. These are things that help animate the ocean, animate objects on the ocean. Okay, same thing with the pond. All right, so we're not going to get into those kinds of things. They actually have examples right here. Get ocean pond examples. And here's different things that you could have: creating wakes, sailing a boat, shark wake, whatever that is, whitecaps, giant storm, high seas, ripple, rowboat. Okay, so there's examples in there for that. There's also fluid examples. Okay, and fluids is one of those things that is, it takes some time just to get used to it, especially just figuring out what it's doing and what all these buttons are doing. So we're going to create something just very simple and kind of, it's semi-realistic looking. But we're going to try to create a fire effect. Okay, so the big thing with fluids is that it's essentially particles. Okay, so just like particles, you can see that we have emitters. So here's the emitter, emit from object. Here's some gradients and some other stuff inside here. But if I just create an emitter, it won't work. Okay, with fluid effects, we have to create a container. So if I create a 3D container, and you see there's a 3D and a 2D. Okay. When I have this 3D container, it's basically saying, okay, this is where my fluid effect is going to happen. So Maya will not try to calculate anything else out here. But unlike your regular particles that are trying to calculate all this other stuff out there, even though your particles are over here. Okay, so this isolates it to a smaller area and makes it a little bit more efficient. So right now I hit play, nothing's going to happen. So I'm going to go under Fluid Effects. I'm going to go to Add Edit Contents, and I'm going to say Emitter. And then I get an emitter. Now that's no different than going to Fluid Effects, create a 3D container with an emitter. There's no difference from what I did, creating a 3D container and then creating the emitter, as opposed to doing that. Okay. Sometimes you may want to have several emitters, and that's why they have this option of adding a second emitter, because you may want to have two emitters inside the same box to do something. Okay. So now I'm going to click on this guy, give myself some frames, so let's say 250. Now if the emitter is outside the box, we get nothing. Okay, the emitter has to be inside the box, and then we'll start to get something. Then it's going to start to actually calculate what it needs to calculate. So I hit play, and we can kind of see something happening here. There's a bunch of dots. Maybe you can see them better when it's in black mode. But there's a bunch of dots here. Yeah, I guess that's the best one. And that's our particles being emitted, essentially. If I hit 5, now I can start to see there's some sort of smoke or something happening here. I'm going to turn my grid off too. Okay. So as I hit play, this is essentially emitting particles, and this particle volume is the smoke that we're seeing here. Okay, now it looks really chunky, and the reason it looks chunky is because this box is not only a container for where our particles are going to be at, but it's also the resolution of those particles. So right now, if you look at the squares that are on here, there's I believe 10 squares going each way, so that'll give us like basically like, let's say 100 dots per inch or 10 dots per inch, whatever you want to look at it. Okay, it's low res. So that's why we're getting this blocky stuff. Okay, and these squares are not called squares. These squares are called voxels. It's like a 3D pixel type thing. Okay, So this is a voxel. And if you imagine that this square is not actually just the square down here, it's actually like a mini little cube, okay? And that follows it all the way up to the top of this. If I go into my attributes, somewhere in here there's a display, and inside here I can say boundary draw full, and you can see there is all those cubes. And what's happening is these pixels or these particles are going from one cube to another and kind of filling it up, okay? So if you imagine that we had more cubes in here, we can get a higher resolution thing. I'm just going to turn this to none, not none, change this to bounding box, that's what I wanted. Just so I don't have to see that bottom, but keep in mind that what we're doing is, it basically is there's a resolution inside here, okay? Alright, so we can manipulate that in several different ways. One is if we go to the box, and we go to this base resolution, and I change this to, let's say, 30, shrink this guy, okay. And scoot this over, rewind it, and play it. And what we should get now is a little bit smoother simulation, because now we have 3 times as many divisions going this way. So we have 30 boxes going this way, so we have 30 boxes going that way, so we have 30 boxes going more higher up, okay? So now we're getting this nice smoother simulation, okay? So we could take this up to ridiculous numbers, okay? And the higher you go with this, like let's say 150, I hit play, you can see how slow this is going to chug, okay? Because it's a lot more work that it has to calculate. So typically, we work at a lower res. Just like most dynamic things that we do, like when we're doing particles, we work at a lower res. So I'm going to keep it at around 30 because it's actually going at a decent speed at around 30, okay? So that's not too bad of a speed to be working with fluid effects. Now you might say, okay, well what's going to happen when this thing hits the top? Well, let's watch and see. Okay? And as it hits the top, it's going to hit it and then start spreading out. If we go to the top view, you can kind of see that effect happening. Okay? So even on the sides, it's going to hit the sides and start spreading downward as well. Let me give myself a little bit more frames here. Okay? So it'll eventually just keep emitting and filling this box up with smoke, okay? And it can never come out, okay? I can't get this stuff to come out of the box. The box is there for a reason. It's there to contain this thing. But what I can do is come down here to these boundaries, and I can change its effect on those things. So if I said that in the Y direction, there is no boundary, what that means is when I hit play now, it's going to go straight through. So it's going to go up and just pretend that there is no Y. So it's just going to cut off. Okay? And the purpose of that is if we're zoomed in here, we don't want to start creeping down the sides. We just want to have this area that we're focusing on. Okay? And I can do the same thing for the X direction and same thing for the Z direction. In this case, it's not really going to have an effect on those things. It's just going to go straight up. Okay? I also have these sizes here. Okay? Now you don't want to ever scale this like that, because what's going to happen is you're going to scale out these voxels. Here's a keep voxel square. You're going to scale up these voxels, and then that's going to stretch them out. You want to scale it here. So if I want this to be twice as tall, I need to do that in here, not out there. Okay? So I can scale it like this proportionately. That's not a big deal. But as far as this, I want to do all my other scaling inside this thing. Okay? And that'll make sure that everything stays nice and neat. Okay? So now I rewind. I can hit play. And you can see it's coming right from this emitter, and it's going straight up. Alright, cool. So I should never see your scales being different. They should all be at 1 or all be at the same value, 0.041, something like that. Okay? You can rotate it. You can move it. You can do whatever you want that way, but don't do it the other way. Now you'll also see that when I hit play and it's just rotated, that this is actually going in this fashion. It's going along that thing as if it was straight up and down. Okay? And it hits the top, like I said, and then it goes away. Alright? So we're going to skip this area for a second. And we're going to come down to content details. There it is. And I'm going to go to density. Okay. Right now, what's happening is we're not really emitting just particles. What we're emitting is density. Okay. We're emitting thickness there. And however you want to look at that, that's what we're emitting. Okay. And I know we're emitting that because if I go to my box here and I go to emission, you can see that there's density voxels being emitted. Okay. And if I click on this box and I go to content methods, you see that density is on here. There's also velocity, which is typically always on. But density and velocity are on here. Temperature's off, fuel is off. Okay? So with density, if I hit play, we're basically like filling this. This is basically just like flat coloring type things, just a dense matter that's filling this box. Okay, I'm going to wait for it to get a little bit fuller in here. Like that. And then I can play with the density scale, and you can see I can thicken it up, or I can thin it down. Okay. I can also change the buoyancy. The buoyancy is this anti-gravity effect of this thing floating up. So if I made this like, let's say 8, and I rewound it, and I hit play, it's going to move quicker up the chain. Okay, I didn't save what frame it was on before, but it's moving quicker going up there. I could also change what's called the dissipation. And the dissipation is going to be it kind of disintegrating, it disappearing. And we may not see a huge effect on it. We kind of see it. It's kind of gone before it even hits the top. Okay? That's the dissipation. And dissipation is a little bit more accurate, I think, than diffusion, where this is actually like disintegrating, where diffusion is just kind of like softening until it goes away. Okay? So a lot of times I use dissipation. Sometimes you'll see people use both, kind of in a mix. And then there's some other ones here which we're not really going to get into too much, but there's lots of different things that you're going to see. Okay, so I'm going to play with this to get a little bit more movement. So I'm going to go to velocity, and I'm going to turn the swirl up. Let's say 6. And then I hit play. And what this is going to do is give it a little bit of noise so it doesn't just come out perfectly straight. You can see that there's a little bit of movement inside here. Okay. I'm also going to come up to higher up, way up, way up, way up. And I'm going to go to further. No, that's not it. Maybe not. Oh, it's under dynamic simulation. I'm going to change my high detail solve to all grids. Okay, and what that means is that it's going to do a better solve than what it was currently doing. Right now it's doing a basic job of just kind of like, you know, basically half-assing it up there. So now it's actually going to take the time and create something that looks neat. Okay, so what we should get is a little bit more movement in this thing, moving around. Let me take my dissipation down. Oops. Because we're dissipating it a little bit too much, and it's like basically just going away. Okay, so I'm going to dissipate it a little bit less. I'm going to take my buoyancy down a little bit less. I'll take my scale back to 1. I'm going to go to my solver quality and just turn that up as well. And then let me make my resolution, my base resolution 60. Now another thing that's going to help me out in this is when I hit play, it's basically, even though we're not doing anything up here, it's still calculating up here. So I can go to my Auto-Resize, and I can turn Auto-Resize on. Okay, I'm going to turn these off, and I'm going to turn that off, and turn this to 6. Okay, I'll show you what those are in a second. So now I hit play, and you can see that now we're calculating just in the area that we're focusing on. And let me reset the rotation on this. Easier to see when it's just straight up and down. Okay. So now we're getting a little bit more movement in here. Instead of this like straight up and down, we're getting a little bit of swirl. We're getting a little bit of high detail movement. So it looks more natural than it did before. Before it looked too CG, too perfect. Okay. So now what do these things do? Let me make this bigger so you can see what the words are here. I turned on Auto-Resize. So what that's going to do is it's automatically going to try to fit the box around my fluid effect. Okay. Resize to emitter is on, so make sure that it fits the emitter. Resize closed boundaries. This one doesn't need to be on right now. It can be on or off, but if we go up to where our boundaries are right here, if we had any of these that were locked at like the X direction or both or whatever, it would not allow it to do resizing of that, or it would allow it if it's clicked and not allow it if it's unclicked. Okay, resizing in sub-steps just means it's going to resize it kind of like between the frames. We don't need to do it between the frames. You can just do it after the frames. This Auto-Resize Threshold, I just turn off and just let it auto-resize automatically. Okay, if this threshold's on, it's going to try to figure out a little bit, more detail of where it needs to solve or where it needs to resize. We don't need that. And then this margin is how much buffer room there is between this and that. So it's the margin of our fluid effect and our scene. If I take this down to 1 and hit play, it's a smaller box around it. If I take it up to be obvious 20, now we have a bigger box around it at the initial start. Okay, so usually this is pretty low just because you don't want it to be extra room on there. Okay, and if you realize that, okay, it's getting a little bit too close for my comfort, you can always bump that number up. Okay, so now there is our smoke coming out of here. And if we render it, we're going to see it looks pretty much what it looks like in here. You can see that it's a pretty close proximity to that one. It's not always going to be the case, but it's pretty close. Okay, and again, we can play with the density and kind of make this a little bit thicker smoke or make it a little bit thinner. We can play with the dissipation more to get it to go away more. We can play with the buoyancy and so on. Okay, so that's density and velocity. And we also have turbulence, so we can also add some turbulence inside here as well. Okay, now we're getting a little more turbulent movement, which is going to kind of move it around in all directions, where swirl was allowing it to go just in the one direction. Okay, so I'm going to take that turbulence off. Now any of these fields, I can just simply click this, go to fields, and I can add any one of these in here that I wanted. So if I want to add gravity to this, I can add gravity. Or if I want to add a Newton or radial or turbulence or anything like that, I can add it inside of this item. Temperature, fuel, color. No, not color. Shading. Okay. There's also some options for surface. You could actually have this if we hit play. See, it's going quick now. I can do a surface render, and it'll actually calculate a surface pretty quick. You saw that I just hit play. And now we have this surface here, and I can play with the threshold, just like we were doing on our particles. And I can play with the tolerance, and play with the coloring, and play with whatever else, specular. Okay. I can make it a soft surface or a hard surface. So right now we're just going to stick with volume, but just so you're aware that it has that stuff. So now, a lot of the magic that we do in here is going to come from the shading area. The shading is basically your texturing. So right now we have transparency, which is not the same as density. Okay, density is actually hiding part of it. Transparency is making it invisible. Okay, all right. Density is getting rid of stuff. This is actually just hiding it, making it less transparent. We have glow, so we can turn the glow up on this. So now it's glowing a little bit. Here it is without glow. Okay. We have this drop-off shape, and if you see as this gets closer to the edges, well, we're not really going to see it because we're resizing, but there's a drop-off shape in here, and it just kind of softens the edge around it. Okay, and some things will kind of call for something like that. In this case, we don't really need the drop-off shape because we're not even getting close to the edge to even have a drop-off shape. Okay, this here is where it gets a little bit complex. So with the color, right now the color is just constant color. I can make it red or yellow or green or whatever. Okay, I have a ramp though. That's what this thing is. If I click in here, and then I click here, and then I choose a different color, blue, you see that I have two colors in here now. I have green and I have blue. If I change, right, it's set to constant, so it's picking up this far right color, like that. If I change this from constant to Y gradient, you'll see that I have green on top and I have blue on the bottom. There we go. Same thing in the render. Okay. And of course I could swap these. I could also go to a center gradient, which will go from this point outward. I can change this to be density. And this is the cool part about fluid effects, is now it's actually going to read the density of the particles and give it a color based on the density of it. So more dense particles will get this green color. Less dense particles will get the blue color. Okay? So as I slide the blue around, now it's opposite. More dense is blue and less dense is green. But we just don't have anything super dense right now, so we're not seeing that. So as we pull this blue in, we're basically saying, okay, any density range that is from this value down, get the blue color, and anything that's in above this, at this point, get the green color, and then everything else just kind of be like a mix between it. Okay? Now we can also change it using this input bias. So I can slide this thing this way or that way and kind of shift the colors and how they're being manipulated. Okay? So now I can get this really cool, like, you know, science-y smoke effect by having this blue here that turns into that green color. Okay? So it's a very, very powerful tool because it allows us the ability to go through and basically create these really cool effects on the density. It's reading the density of this thing and then assigning colors to that in a 3D kind of fashion. Okay? So there's the color part. Now if we look down here at incandescence, it has the same exact slider type thing. This one is automatically set to temperature, but I could also set this to density. And now what it's going to do is it's going to glow. The more dense it is, the more it's going to glow. Okay, and I can even crank this up to like that. And I'll turn glow on a little bit and render it. Let me turn it up a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit of incandescence from this, and we're also getting a little bit of glow in here. Glow off. And again, it's reading that density. And I can play with the slider here just like I was playing with the slider in the other one. Okay. Now incandescence is going to be added on top of our color. So our color, right now we've given it color information. So this yellow is going to kind of like, you see it like overrides it. Okay. So you have to be careful when you're using color here and color there because one will eventually override the other one. Like that. Okay, so our red and blue are gone, and now we have this orangey color. Okay, we also have opacity, and opacity has a little bit different setup. Because opacity is based on black and white values, there's no point in giving it color, so we just use this ramp. And the ramp stands for totally opaque on this side, totally transparent on this side, 0 opacity, and then totally transparent on this, totally opaque on this side. So full opacity, no opacity. And then in the middle, whatever we want. So we can just click and add points in here, and basically we're defining how that's going to be affecting it. Okay? So how do we want this stuff? We want it like mostly opaque. So we can pull these things up like this. Or, let me click the X's at the bottom. We want to be mostly transparent and just have this little wisp of smoke inside there. Okay, and then again we can play with this input bias and get different effects on this opacity by playing with that. Okay, so now it's set to density, so that's what it's going to do. But again, we can set this to a gradient. We can set it to a constant. It'll just do the end result. We can set it to center gradient. And there's other things that we can do here that we'll eventually get to. There's also shading quality, which we'll get to later. There's texturing. There's lighting. Render stats. Okay. You can see it's not visible just like our other stuff. Not visible in reflections or refractions by default. Okay. So that's the gist of what fluid effects is. Okay. Now let's get into creating something that's a little bit more realistic looking. So I'm going to go in here, and right now where basically this fluid volume is full of density, okay, just this kind of smoky mass. I'm going to add temperature, I'm going to add fuel by changing both these to dynamic grid, okay? And dynamic grid means that as the particles are being emitted, it's kind of generating this stuff on the fly. So now as I hit play, we're most likely not going to see a huge difference here. There we go. Let's stop it about there. So right now we're not seeing a huge difference. I'm going to come down here to our content details, or our shading, and I'm going to just get rid of some of this and kind of set this color back to its default. And its default was kind of this gray. And you can see that when I take this and put this back to gray, then now that we're using this incandescence, it's actually kind of adding onto that a little bit better. Now here's where using temperature and fuel come in, is I can take this and change this to temperature. And now what's going to happen is the temperature of this is basically like a fire, okay? We have fuel down here, and the fuel is going to ignite, and it lights it up, and we get this big, strong heat down here, this big temperature, and then the temperature is going to go up. So what we're going to do is, let me take this off too. There we go. This heat down here is the temperature right there, and the temperature is eventually going to disappear, and we'll be left with density. Okay, so essentially we're emitting two particles here. We have the temperature particles, which is partly by the fuel, and then we have the density particles in here. And the temperature ones are going to go for so long that they're going to disappear and turn into density ones. Okay, but realistically it's all density, it's just a matter of where the temperature is. So you can see how we have this little like fireball in there. And then we have this smoke going around it. Now this is where sometimes we have to render this to get a better view of what's happening. Okay, so I'm going to go and play with some of these settings. I'm going to take this arrow here and click it, and that just pops this off so I can get a better view. Now I'm just going to tighten this up. And I'm going to click on the yellow, and pull the value up. Right now it's at 1.5. Okay, so it's pretty bright. So I'm going to crank it up to maybe 2.6. I'll take the orange, and I'll pull the orange up as well to maybe 1.5. And close it. Okay. I also want to have a little bit more temperature kind of getting up higher. So I'm going to go up to where my content detail is, and under temperature, I'm going to increase the temperature scale. Okay, so I set that up to maybe not that high. Maybe 1.5, and I'm going to set my buoyancy to maybe 8, and I'm going to set my dissipation to maybe, let's say 0.6. Okay, and no diffusion. Let's get rid of that. Okay, rewind it. We'll hit play. And so right now our temperature is going in there, and it's going to burn off. You can see that it gets to a certain point and it just goes away. Okay, and then we're left with this smoky look. Okay, so there we have no temperature at all. All the temperature is right inside here, and then all of this is just smokiness. So if I come down to my color, this one I'm going to take to maybe black. You can see we go right to black, we get basically like a fiery color. And then over here, I'm going to make this a grayer color. Okay, and I can play with where this is at right here. Okay, so now if I go through and I add a little bit of glow, 0.1, I render this out. You can see now we're getting more of a fire in here with this smoke kind of puffing off the top of it. Let's go a little bit more glow on there. There we go. Okay. So now what we can do is I'm going to go through my opacity. I'm going to click this arrow. I'm going to change how it's being opaque. So I'm just going to create, and you'll see this a lot if you look at a lot of stuff, is that you'll have this like little spike that comes up. And some people will go through and just kind of play with this in order to get a different result on this. And all this is doing is changing the look of the opacity. Okay? And then I can come through and play with this to get it to be opaque in certain areas and transparent in certain areas. So by going here, let's say, and rendering this out, I'm not seeing a whole lot here, and my smoke looks like it's a little bit too thick. So I can, oops, I also want this opacity based on temperature. There we go. So I'm going to pull this down some, and then go back and render it. Okay, we're still not getting a whole lot. And that's why we have to render it, because we're not getting, there we go. Now we're getting some embers there. Now we can start pulling this up a little bit more. There's some more embers. There we go. So I've gone just, it's like right at the border of where I want it. There we go. So maybe something like that is where we're at. And I may need to play this a little bit further just to get a little bit more movement on it. Okay, and I could also be in my density, if I go to my density, I could also be dissipating this too much and it's getting rid of it. So let me get rid of my density dissipation. Okay, and my buoyancy for the density, let's set this to maybe 3. Okay, so my buoyancy for temperature is 8, my buoyancy for density is 3. And it really helps if we add a background to this, because as we hit render, okay, we can see this, but is there any smoke up here? Okay, not yet, but there will be eventually. So I'm going to add just a cube. I'm going to delete those sides and just hit 3 to smooth this guy out. Okay, and that way I just get this nice little area that I can preview this and kind of see what's going on. And I want to render it through Mental Ray. Okay, so there's my smoky stuff. It needs work, obviously. So maybe I'll take my temperature scale down some. Maybe my scale is just a little bit too high. And I'm going to change my maximum resolution on my Auto-Resize to 600. Okay, if this goes to 200, it basically like caps out and doesn't create any more. So I'm just going to make sure that's good. What else? I can set this to temperature also and just see, you know, what's the effect on that. Okay, right now not a whole lot. Density was probably the better one in this choice. That's temperature, so this is good. I want that to be about there. I can play with this, you know, being density or being temperature and see which I'm liking better. Okay. I can also go to my emitter and say I want to emit a lot more density in my scene. So I can add 5 density bits, or whatever their units are, 5 density particles or voxels per second, and give myself a little bit more density. Okay, now I'll render this again. And now we're getting a little bit more smoke in there than we had before, which is good. I can also go in here and add some more heat if I need it, or some more fuel. There's also, if I come to my basic emitter attributes, I can change the maximum distance that this thing is emitting. Right now, if we hit play, there's like this circle that's emitting from here. If I made this like 5, okay, it's going slower, but now it's emitting from this bigger distance. Even though it's not terribly visible, it is. And again, these numbers are going to depend on your scale of your scene as to what they're doing. Okay, so just to show some of the stuff that we can create with this, and we're going to kind of walk through one of these. Here's one of the fires that I made. So you can see where basically we have this temperature here, and it's coming out, and it's essentially it's turning into the temperature is going away, and we're turning into just density, where that's where we get that black smoke. Okay, and this shape here is actually an object that's emitting from. So let me open up another one. This one is just smoke. I don't think that was a very good one. No, that wasn't. It's an okay one, but it got a little bit too blocky, and my shadows back here look really funky. And I have another one that's in here, Fire 3. And this one I've like rotated this thing just to see, you know, we get different results. Okay. So now let's start a new scene, and we'll kind of walk through one of these things together. So I'm going to go to Fluid Effects. I'm going to create a 3D container with an emitter. And the only difference between a 2D and a 3D is that the 3D has 3 dimensions, and the 2D doesn't have 3 dimensions. So we can do different types of things with it. We'll give ourselves some more frames. I'm going to grab this and make the base resolution 60 to start. I'll take my height and make it 20. And a lot of this is going to depend on what your scene is. Okay, if you have a specific scene where your smoke is going to be coming out of a pillar or something, then you have to kind of figure out how much smoke and where it's going to be and whatever else. You kind of figure out the size. Right now we're just kind of experimenting with this. You wouldn't want to make this enormous, because the bigger you make this, the more voxels, the more resolution you have to fit into it to make it look good. Okay, so just be aware of that. I'm going to take my Y direction and take that to a negative boundary. So that means that there's only a boundary on the bottom. I'm going to take my emitter and also pull it down. Okay, dynamic grid for density, dynamic grid for velocity, dynamic grid for temperature, dynamic grid for fuel. Under dynamic simulation, I'm going to go to high detail solve and turn that to all grids. That just gives me a better solve. That's all it's doing. Solver quality 25. Again, just upping the quality of that. You can crank this up even higher, but you don't want to do that. My simulation rate scale. Okay, it was kind of moving slow in the previous one, so I can actually just say I want this thing to simulate 1.5 times faster than it normally does. There's some other stuff in here that you can look at if you get time. Here's some liquid stuff, so you can actually do like a liquid simulation inside of this to fill like a cup of coffee or something. Auto-Resize we definitely want. We want to turn these two off. We'll turn our max resolution up to 600. That goes away. This goes to like 6. Self-attraction we don't need to worry about. Content details we'll worry about later. Okay, so let's see where we're at now. And again, we get the little dots. I'm going to hit 5 so we can see what it's looking like. And I'm actually rendering right now, so it actually will go quicker on your station. Okay, so there's no turbulence or anything happening in this. This is just it emitting and going straight up. Okay, and we are getting some little wafts, little like things that are kind of sticking out. Okay, so I'm going to grab the box again. I'm going to go down to my content details, go down to velocity, and I'm going to add some swirl to this, like 8. And then rewind it and hit play. Now what the swirl is going to do is just kind of swirl the particles around. Okay, so it's not going to go straight up. We're going to get some kind of side-to-side motion on this. Okay, and I probably want to take off my auto reset or my boundaries. I'm going to take off my X and Z. Okay, and this will make it go a little quicker too, because now it's not going to be as big. Okay, now it's going pretty slow going vertically, so I'm going to go to my temperature. I'm going to take the buoyancy up to 8. Okay, a little bit more buoyancy in the temperature will kind of push this vertically a little bit quicker. Okay, you can see how it's kind of being forced upwards. Okay, I also want my temperature to start dissipating. We're not going to really see that yet, so I'm going to do that after we start playing with our textures. Okay, maybe I'll take my buoyancies or my density's buoyancy up also. And maybe we'll take the density scale up to 0.75. Okay, and keep in mind too that this is a static flame. Okay, if we had this thing animated, it could look a bit fancier. Like we talked about, we can add motion capture data to a lot of these things, and have these things move around. Okay, so let's say this is where we're kind of going good. Let's come down to our shading. And I'm going to go down to shading quality first and just turn this up to 2. Turn my render interpolation to smooth, just so it kind of gives me a nicer visual. My color I'm going to take to dark, okay, because I'm going to use my incandescence to color my fire. Okay, so that means that this should be dark so that I get this incandescence as what's coloring it. And then down here, I'm just going to add a little bit of a gray. Okay, and then I want to set this to be set to temperature. That way temperature is going to be here and not there. Okay, I can actually swap those. There we go. So now this dark side is where the temperature is, and this light side is where the density is. And again, we can play with where this line is happening as we adjust things. So now this one, I want basically, this is basically like fire, just like boom, fire. So I want this to turn into smoke. So I'm going to say, okay, at some point, we're not going to have anything over here. This is just going to be black. This is where my smoke is going to be. This line is where it transitions from fire into smoke. So I'm just going to make sure this is at 0, which it is. I'm going to grab my yellow and just make the yellow a bit brighter just to kind of help kind of boost some of that. So I'm going to about 2.5, 2.6-ish. Same thing with the orange. I'm going to crank this up to maybe 1.6. Make that a little bit brighter. Okay, and again, we can play with the slider to kind of feed some of this into it. And of course, we'll render it just to see what it's looking like. Okay. And then we can go down to opacity, and we'll change this to temperature. Click that. And again, we'll make this little like bump inside here. And I try to make it at about, this area here. And what I like to do too, let me just get rid of all these guys. We'll take this thing one step at a time on this guy. Okay, so right now we have temperature as being our driver. Let me reset that to 0. So way up here where we have lots of temperature, we're getting lots of opacity. Where we don't have lots of temperature, we're getting very little opacity. Okay, so if we render this, this is what we're getting, is this kind of cutoff thing. Okay, so if I say, okay, well, where we have temperature, I want to have some opacity. And then where we have smoke, I want to have some opacity too. I can also play with it like this, and it gives me a different result. Oops. Sometimes when you try to grab one, you actually make another one. There you go. Okay. And then again, we can play with this to kind of play with that line of where all this stuff is happening. But the way to understand this stuff is just to kind of go through and see what your results are getting. So I want this, and then we go through a little transparent phase, and then we go back to more of a transparency on the smoke. Okay, so now as this thing is kicking up, we're getting this flame and then these little puffs of smoke. And again, let me create that polycube. And delete. faces, hit 3. And the only reason I'm hitting 3 is just to get a nice smooth backdrop. Okay, so now we're starting to get this fire in here. And we can go down to glow, and we can add a little glow. And I can take the transparency of this down a little bit as well, if I need to. And that transparency is kind of like an overall transparency. There you go. So now we're starting to get this fire here. But I want to start killing off this temperature a little bit sooner. So I'm going to go to the dissipation for the temperature and turn this up to 1. And if you watch any videos on using fluid effects, typically the first thing the person does is create a box, and then or an emitter grid. They'll create an emitter, and then they'll go through and they'll just say, okay, I'm doing fire, so I'm going to set this to this, this to this, this to this, this to this. And they go through this like checklist basically of all the settings that they want to set for fire, and that's what they're using. Okay, so there's our smoke there. Or our fire there. So let's go through and we can play with some of these settings, maybe to get this core to read a little bit better. Okay, so maybe our core is just a little bit too opaque. So let's take that and pull this down some. So I basically got rid of that first bump there, just so we can get a little bit more transparency in the center. Okay, and it looks like it might even be coming from our temperature scale. Maybe we want to crank this down a little bit. Okay, less temperature scale here. You can see how I'm minimizing the amount of temperature that's in there. And I can also go up to my density scale and start pulling up my density a little bit as well. There we go. Okay, so let's rewind this and play again. Okay, I think I took my density scale, my temperature scale down a little bit too much. So let's take this temperature scale back up to maybe 0.75. There we go. So now we have this nice little hot spot in here, and then we have this orange glowing area that's inside there. Okay, so let's take our buoyancy on the density up as well. Rewind it, we can hit play. Now it's kind of hard to see. Let me go through and change some of my shading parameters. Put that down. Go to this. Okay, I'm darkening the smoke. That's what that's doing. Alright, and the smoke is actually glowing, so let me take that. Make sure incandescence is all the way off. There it is. Take the glow down. Maybe it's just a little bit too much at 0.1. There we go. So now we can see the smoke coming out of here as well. And then going through and maybe playing with maybe a little bit more density scale. Or going through the emitter and adding a little bit more density here. I got a little bit too high on that one. So go back to 2 here. Yeah, we'll take the density scale down to 2.5. What's happening is the density is just too thick, and it's like overriding the temperature. So now we're basically just getting smoke with a tiny bit of fire in there. Yeah. Okay, so I've just gone a little bit too high on that. Let me take my temperature scale up. There we go. That might be too much, but then we can play with it still. That doesn't look too bad. Okay, I think I want the smoke to be a bit blacker. So then we can come down to our transparency. And I can play with this too. Maybe I want this coloring here to be basically like black to this. A little bit of transparency, or a little bit of transition in there. Or I probably want to take this gray and make it even darker. Yeah, let's take this gray here. Make that darker. There we go. So now we got like black smoke. Okay, and then I'm just adjusting these sliders just to kind of get just a better effect on this. Okay, so the slider is basically just adjusting where the temperature is at. We're pushing this adjustment towards. And I think that's looking pretty nice right there. Okay, now it's just a matter of kind of tweaking the look of the movement. Okay, and at the beginning it's a little bit harder to kind of adjust it, you know, to get it right off the bat. All right, so that looks good. All right, so that looks pretty neat right there. We have a nice little coloring. We could probably down the color a little bit more transparency on that. So let's take our temperature scale down some. Okay. Yeah, we could even dissipate it a little bit sooner than that as well. Okay, at the start of this you always get this like big little poof that happens first. There we go. And now I'll render this. Alright, so now we have this little fireball, and then we have this little smoke puff right there. Okay. Now there is a, oops, let me click that, there's a caching, so the caching is going to work the same way that our other caches work. There's an initial state, so you can say, okay, I want to set this as my initial state, and then clear it if you need to clear it, or then save it as, okay. We could also, I can delete this emitter. Nothing's going to happen. I hit play, nothing happens. And then I can put a piece of geometry in here. Okay, and I click on the piece of geometry, I shift click the emitter, and I say Fluid Effects, Add Edit, Emit from Object. So now I'm going to emit from this object my fire that we just set up. Let me rotate it. And you can see we're going to get a lot more fire kicking up out of here because we have a bigger surface. There we go. And then, of course, if this was like a fire inside of a fireplace, we could just grab some of the logs and use those logs. Or we can just grab this thing and just hide it if we didn't want to see that. We just wanted it to emit from some sort of shape. There we go. So it looks pretty convincing as far as fire goes, and for the amount of time we spent on it, is much better than, you know, the effects create fire in here, which is like the old-fashioned cheesy looking fire. Okay. But the biggest trick with this, the biggest issue that you're going to have is just trying to figure out where you're going to edit stuff. So you have to be able to look at this and say, okay, well, I'm editing the look of this orangey fire part, so I need to either come to one of these and adjust the coloring. So where is this fire happening at? Or I need to go to my color, maybe adjust this slider to adjust that. Or I need to go to my opacity and play with this. Just for fun, let's see what that looks like. That. Crazy. It's a lot of smoke. Okay. Or do I need to go up to my temperature settings and start to adjust my temperature scale? Okay, you see I take my temperature scale down, I lose a lot of the stuff that's inside here. Okay, but these settings, or this setting, is more of like you can adjust it on the fly. There we go, we have an atomic bomb. There goes that 1.5. This setting here, you can just adjust and update it right there and see what it's going to look like. And sometimes you may want to experiment, just say, I'm going to add some noise in here and see what that does. Okay. There's also down here something that's going to help is under lighting, is we're going to tell it we want it to self-shadow. And then we can either use real lights or we can tell it where we want this light to be. And this is basically like a vector of where it's aiming at. So if we render this, it's creating this stand-in light that's using to create the shadows for it. Okay, so whatever you want to use real lights, use real lights. Otherwise, you can use this kind of directional light, which I think it's a little bit tricky to kind of figure out. Where do I want this thing aiming at? So sometimes just turn that off or turn that on and create your own. Okay, and shadow opacity we can crank up to get more contrast in our shadows. Okay, now let me save this one. Fireball. And again, you can have multiple emitters too, just for fun before I close this one. So there's another sphere in here. There it is. I'll even put it outside. And I'll go to Image from Object. So you'll see how the Auto-Resize automatically is going to find it and then put it in there. And it's going to emit from this sphere. And if the sphere is animated, and I could actually make this a dynamic sphere like an end cloth or a bullet sphere and just tell Maya that that's an emitter, and it'll read that as being an emitter. So now we have fire coming off of the sphere, we have fire coming out down here. And I made it fire, but obviously you could change the colors and make it look like anything. You can make it look like smoke. You can make it look like, sciencey green smoke type thing from a science lab. Okay. But typically I like to use objects instead of just an emitter. I use the emitter just to kind of set it up because it's a little bit quicker than trying to cache this stuff out. You see I'm only at frame 24. There's our fireballs. They're really hot. Okay. And then the renderings is the same thing that we would do before. Always cache your stuff out. So go to cache, create a new cache. Same thing. Make sure it's cached as far as you're going to go. Go to your render settings. Change your quality up to 1 or 2, depending on how good you want it to be. Change it to AF, whatever. You know the settings that you need to set in here to render this stuff out. Okay, so I'm going to save it. Now I'm just going to open up my other one just so you can see what those settings were on that one. So let me go set the project to that one. Okay. All right, so this is the other one that I set up. Now this one, instead of being an object, is an emitter, but it's a volume emitter. And I literally just animated it just kind of like moving up and down. Okay. All of these are set to 1, 1, 1, and 1. Nothing I changed here. Nothing fancy. On the shape itself, you see that I kind of rotated it sideways just to show that we can go sideways with it. And what you can do too is you can, and show this in the other one, but you can actually go to make collide, so you can have objects collide with it. So you can create a sphere inside here. Shift-click that and go to Fluid Effects, make collide, and now that sphere will collide with whatever it is your fluid effect is doing. So when it comes out, it'll hit it and collide. And this one, I didn't think I set the boundary on it. Okay. Okay. The other thing you can do too is if you want to use the boundaries, one reason you would want to use them is, let's say we had like a box here. Like so. Okay, instead of me colliding this with a box and having it, being inside there, I could just pretend it's the boundary and let it collide with the boundary. That way I don't have to worry about it. Okay, it's not going to collide with the box, it's just going to look like it's colliding with the box. Alright, so there we go. So I set my base resolution up to 100, okay? And typically before you go for your final renders, you'll pull that up to a higher number, like 100. I've seen 200 before. I've seen, I don't think I've seen anything higher than about 200. But this base resolution you typically crank up. You can see how dense this mesh is, but obviously it's going to go super slow, which is why when I hit play, it only gets to frame 4 and then just kind of sits there for a few minutes. All these are the same that we talked about, dynamic grid for all of them. My simulation rate scale I put to 2 because I wanted it to go a little bit quicker. Okay. My solver quality is 25. My high detail solves on all grids, same thing we did before. Here's my Auto-Resize, same exact settings. This is at 0.1. I think I put it to 0 in the other one. My density scale is 2. My buoyancy is 5. My dissipation is 0.15. I have a 5 swirl on the velocity, a little bit of noise. My temperature is 12 for my temperature scale. My buoyancy is 8. My dissipation is 6. A little bit of transparency, kind of in the middle-ish. A little bit of glow. Here's what my temperature looks like. Here's what my incandescence looks like. Okay, you can see where the numbers are here. You can look at all the numbers all day long, but realistically it's just going to be playing with it. It's just me going in there and playing with it. And in this one I use density as my opacity input, but obviously in the other one, temperature seemed to work good too. So a lot of times it's just a matter of playing with these things until you get stuff that you're happy with. Okay. Shading quality, I left a 1 on here. It still looked good at 1. Okay, I didn't do self-shadowing on this one, but I didn't think I needed it. Okay. So you have the gist of this. Your next step is to just create something using fluid effects. Now, I would recommend going to YouTube and just look at ideas. Look at different things that you can do with fluid effects inside here. Shading, fluid effects. So here are some fluid effects that are inside here. And just by looking at this, you can get an idea of the different colors that are inside here and how they're doing that just using those color maps and using those opacity maps. Okay, and you can see how this is kind of like coming up and disappearing. Well, that's that dissipation. That's kind of like it just comes up and goes away, comes up and goes away. Okay, here's my fire with end particles. So in this case, you're using end particles for the other stuff and then fire for that. Trail or ink and water type thing. So here you're just showing this little smoky trail like that. Okay, so that's another cool thing that's out there. And you have to play with it. I mean, we've talked about this every class basically. But you have to go out there and play with it and try to just see what else is out there because you just don't know until you actually physically see this stuff happening. And then you go through and create it. And some of these like this are just very cool. We could take that simulation rate scale and crank that down to like ridiculously low numbers and create these like really cool slow motion effects. Okay? Alright, so find something cool that you really want to do to kind of show off one of these types of effects. And it could even be, you know, a meteor just kind of coming in and slamming into something and just kind of bouncing around a little bit. Okay? With these resize things, this auto resize, we can animate the sphere moving along and it'll automatically resize to it. Okay, we could even parent it to the sphere. And so that as we move this, there we go. So as we move it, it's going to come along with it. Okay, but we wouldn't get that effect of it trailing because it's moving with it. All right, but what we could do is just have it move and it'll automatically resize as it's going. Just be careful when you do stuff like that because that resolution can get very, very big. Okay, so go out there, look at some stuff, and just create some really cool effect with this. Now, I'd recommend you stay away from stuff like tornadoes because usually people say, okay, I want to do a tornado. And it is possible to do. It just takes time because you really have to be able to control the movement of that tornado using the fluid effect. And there's so much stuff going on in there. The same thing with this. Okay, there's just so much stuff going on in this thing in order to get all this stuff to work correctly. Alright, it's very cool, but again, it takes a lot of time. Okay, here's a little nuke effect, which is kind of cool. Let's get the ad. I guess we'll wait. There's an example of Maya fur, maybe. Here he is showing off some of his fluids, fire tests. Now, in order to capture a lot of these, he has to have that resolution cranked up really high. There's so much detail in a lot of the stuff that he's doing in here. And you're by no means going to master this tool by doing one tutorial. It takes many tutorials, many weeks and months to kind of play with it to even get a very good understanding of what you're doing with it in order to create some of these things that this guy's doing. But obviously, if he's going into effects, that's the kind of stuff that he wants to show off. Okay? So that's fluid effects. It's fun stuff. It's just a matter of getting through and understanding how that how the tool's working compared to all the other stuff, because it's obviously much, much more different than a lot of the other tools that we've used. Okay? So have fun with it.